Grandma's Marmalade. So at this point in 2020, you have probably run out of the vintage 1986, and you're a bit worried about whether you're going to be replenishing supply. I mean, it has been a long time. So what I'd like to do is share with you the recipe, and it's actually fairly straightforward. This is a recipe from the Women's Institute, which was, I believe, one of Grandma's preferred cookbooks for all manner of things. And so I'll show you the process. First, let's talk ingredients. This is the 3 fruits recipe, and for that you need 2 grapefruit, 2 oranges, and 4 lemons. You also need about 2 3/4 kilos of white sugar, and the recipe calls for about 6 British pints of water, so I'm kind of working on the 3-liter range. What I find is in the recipe, you're actually spending a lot of time evaporating water, so you don't necessarily want to add too much water at first. So you can have upwards of maybe even 4 liters, but I'm going to see if I can get away with a bit less. The other thing you're going to want is a good thermometer. You're basically taking the sugar fruit mixture up to about 110 degrees centigrade, and so you need to monitor that. I find these digital thermometers are really great because they even take it up to 500 degrees if you needed to. So, but yeah, try to avoid things with mercury. It's not good for the marmalade. A heavy pot to do most of your cooking in, large. I also see that in the Women's Institute cookbook there is a pressure cooker method. I'm kind of doing a hybrid of 2 methods involving both the pressure cooker and not. But I found that for a stage of the cooking, it's also helpful to have the pressure cooker in there. You also need some kind of straining device. I happen to have a food mill, which is helpful, but I don't think you necessarily need it if you have something like this and a spatula to push some of the solids through. What happens is you're going to be trying to push through some of the pulp, but remove any seeds and remove any of the pith or connective tissue inside of the citrus fruits, while meanwhile preserving the actual skin. So first thing I'm going to do is wash the fruit. Depending upon the state of your fruit, you may need a scrub brush, but I've generally found that washing by hand is fine under cold water. So the next thing is to prepare the fruit, and that involves cutting off the skin, getting rid of the stems if there are any, and sorting the pulp and the skin material into 2 separate containers. I'm going to put the pulp, or the sweet stuff, into my pressure cooker. If you don't have a pressure cooker, it's totally fine. You just need a heavy pot that you can simmer for a fairly long time until everything is really soft, because that's the stuff you are going to be pushing through a sieve a bit later. And then you need another container for your skin. Now, I'm ultimately going to be running the skin through a food processor. If you don't have a food processor, then you just basically have to chop things up finely with a knife. And given the amount of fruit, that is not really a difficult thing to do. So, prepping the fruit. And you've got these little green stems. Those can disappear. Don't need those. But basically everything else in the fruit is completely usable. Nice thing about cutting off the end like this is that it creates a flat surface that you will see is going to be very useful. No stems on that one. All right, so we got a little flat surface here, which is just going to make the piece of fruit stable on the cutting board. It's okay to trim off the top as well, especially if it's got, you know, that rough bit. That bit you don't want necessarily in your marmalade. Looks ugly, so that's got to go. You might have to dig out, you know, a bit of the orange or the lemon. Just inspect it. You know, as you're taking this stuff apart, you just kind of look at it and decide whether that's something you'd like to see on a piece of toast. So, what I tend to do is I basically get the knife in and I trim down along the curve of the fruit. And so what you end up with is basically the skin and the pith and as minimal amount of the actual fruit itself as possible. All right, and then you can use this line here and kind of use your knife to trace down the rest of the way. And in this manner, you remove all of the skin on the fruit. And the longer the strokes you use, especially if you have a sharp knife, and I recommend everybody have a sharp knife, the better off your cutting experience will be. So again, you know, if you see anything that you don't like, that you wouldn't want to have in your marmalade, be sure to remove it. Okay. Now I just want to reiterate that all of this is being used in the marmalade. We just have to give it different treatments. So apparently citrus fruits have all of the pectin that you need to make a marmalade. You don't have to add any extra pectin. Unlike, for example, berries, which don't have any pectin. All the pectin is located in the pith and also in the seeds. And so that is usable to us. And of course then you've got the sweet fruit that provides, you know, the rest of the flavor. So what I tend to do is I am going to segment my fruity bits and those are going to go into my pressure cooker pot, right? And again, I just use the pressure cooker because it really does speed things up. I processed things in the pressure cooker for about 15 minutes, where I imagine if I were simmering on the stove, it would probably take much longer than that. So just out of the interests of time, I did that. Then the other thing I'm going to have is my bowl for the skin and pith. This is going to go into a food processor. If you don't have a food processor, then your best bet, again using a sharp knife, is to basically cut your skin into the size of strips, the width of strips that you would prefer to see on your toast. And then what you need to do is just basically come along and do that. Okay? And yeah, it'll take you a little while, but you do get done. And again, we're not working with a large amount of fruit here, so I'm just going to carry on. If you find your cutting board is slipping and sliding like mine is, it's really important to stabilize that. So put a tea towel underneath your cutting board to make it stable. Okay, that's going in the food processor. This is going in the food processor. All this pith. And then the rest of the fruit is going into the pressure cooker. Stay tuned as I work through lemons and grapefruits. So I've got my fruit centers in the pressure cooker here. I'm just going to add a little bit of water. I probably don't need it, but just in the event that, you know, something scalds to the bottom of the pan. So I'm going to put this on kind of a medium heat, or just enough that it's you know, sizzling out the top for about 15 minutes. And that should be enough to soften the fruit in the center and allow me to pass it through the strainer. Next thing I'm going to do is take the pith and the peel, and I'm going to work it through the food processor. And again, if you don't have a food processor and you do it by hand, I mean, it's a fair amount of mincing, but you know, it's doable in a reasonable amount of time. The trick for the food processor, of course, is not to use too much at once. So that's probably good. I'm going to do this in about 2 batches. Pulse it. Until we get things down to the size we want to see in our marmalade, which is pretty close to that. You'll see there are a few big pieces, but we can remove those and deal with them later. Okay, so something about that size. Alright, so here is all my pulp and skin, and I just add the water. And that was basically a full liter, and it's not enough. I mean, as you can see, it's just barely submerging most of what's there. So I actually do need more water. The reason we use a lot of water here, and I'm basically going for my 2nd liter, so that's 2 liters in the big pot. The purpose of this part of the process is to remove the pectin from the skin and pith, and also to pull the essential oils out of the skins. You know, the essential oils and the skins are where all the flavor is, but the pectin is mostly in the pith and in the seeds. And so what we have to do is we have to simmer this for about 1.5 hours. And so I shall turn my heat up to, oh, I don't know, 4-ish. I mean, I might turn it up to 7, and then once it starts simmering, I will turn the heat down, but then I let it go for 1.5 hours. Meanwhile, my pressure cooker is doing nothing. It's heating up. It's just starting. I might turn that one up to speed things along, but I'll turn it back down once I start getting the sizzle. So what does my stove look like? I've got a pressure cooker that is not going high temperature crazy. It's just got a little bit of sizzle going on. It's probably been, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. And then I also have simmering pith and peel. And I'm going to put the lid back on this one in a minute, just to let it simmer. So like I say, it's 15 minutes. It really needs to go for about 1.5 hours. You may need to add water if you're not careful. So just keep an eye on it. Don't have it boiling too hard. I'm probably going to turn this down to a lower heat, so it was on. It was on 8, and now it's down to like 3 or 4. So, all right. So this was the fruit that was in the pressure cooker, and what you can see is that this is just really, really soft, and that's what you're shooting for. Like I say, it was only 15 minutes, just barely over a sizzle. But what's happening with this really soft fruit is that the seeds are they fall right out, and that's going to make it really easy to when I start using the food mill or a strainer with a spatula to separate out the pulp from the from the seeds and the more chewy bits. The next plan of action is to separate the bits, the good bits from the bad bits. So I'm just going to use my food mill here, which is really handy. And the food mill goes round and round. All the juice we're going to save. And in a minute it'll come down to the dry stuff, which is what we're interested in. Alright, so you see that it's thinning out here. And importantly, what you have on the bottom side is all of this stuff on the bottom. All that pith, you want that, all that pulp you want to go into your marmalade. So that will leave the really tough centers of the fruit, and I think that's good enough for now. So basically what's left is this and the sugar is all going to go into that pot over there. It hasn't been an hour and a half yet, so I won't be adding that yet. But I'm probably going to take the lid off at this point. It's still working at a nice simmer. There's plenty of liquid in there, so there's nothing burning at the bottom. So there is the stuff simmering away, and again, the purpose of this was to remove all the pectin from the pith and skin, as well as the essential oils from the skin for flavor. You'll notice that a lot of the water is evaporated at this point, and that's not a bad thing. You just need to make sure you're on top of it so that there's no scalding at the bottom. Apparently you can get away with a shorter amount of time for this simmer stage if you have small pieces. So the simmer time has to do is a function of the size of your chopping. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the pulp. I'm going to add sugar. But wait, there's more. And that all has to dissolve, which may or may not be an easy thing with the amount of existing water that's in there. And this is where you're supposed to add more water if you need to. If you recall, I only added about half of the water before. It was about 2 liters, which means I have another liter in reserve. But the important thing here is to get all the sugar dissolved. So that may require me to add my third liter. So I'm going to do that. Actually, that's the 4th liter, not the 3rd. I apologize. Now, this is where your handy dandy thermometer comes in. Oops. I'm sorry I'm working in Fahrenheit, but that is right now 115. And the goal is to get this up to, in Fahrenheit, 230, which is about 110 centigrade. So what boiling at sea temperature is 212, and we're basically cooking a sugar syrup till it gets to the right consistency. And when you've got sugar plus acidity plus temperature and pectin, then you have all the makings of jams and jellies. So I'm just going to let that go. Time now is 4:57. We'll see how long it takes to get this reduced. But I'm going to come in and I'm going to check on a pretty regular basis the temperature, and I'm going to make sure I give it a good stir as well to make sure there's nothing sticking to the bottom, because if you burn this, you ruin the whole batch. One of the things you can do at this point while you're waiting for your marmalade to cook is to prepare your jars, various sizes. So think about who you're going to be making gifts for, and who you're going to woo at your office for good favor, and choose the appropriate size jar. Basically all I've done is I've just washed them out with soap and water, but there's going to come a point when you have to put the marmalade in the jar. The sugar syrup is going to be hot, very hot. And so you need to preheat the jars a bit. You don't want to be putting the marmalade into a cold jar. So what I tend to do is I warm the jars slightly in the oven, on a very low heat, just to get them up around, 50 degrees centigrade, 80 degrees centigrade, just to prepare them to receive hot liquid. Alright, so this stuff's going at a decent clip at the moment. I'm going to turn the heat down. It's at level 6, which is halfway up. So I'm probably going to drop this down to a 4 or a 3. And one of the things we have to do is that you see there's a scum that's developing. We need to get a small ladle and we need to start skimming that off. And at this point, come back like every 5 minutes and you just skim and skim and skim. When in doubt, give it a stir and then skim again. And so the next hour or so will be basically coming back, stirring, skimming, checking the heat, making sure that it's not burning, not sticking. Checking the temperature, which right now is at the center of this large pot, 140, 212, look at that, boiling temperature. And this needs to go up to 230. When we last left off, it was about 5:30 or so. It's now 6:18, and you can see I've got the stove on a medium-low heat. It's a 4 out of 10, and the color is darkening. I still have some skimming to do. There's a bit of concentration. And when I go to check the temperature, again, sorry, working in Fahrenheit. When I go to check the temperature, I have passed boiling point. This is at 216 degrees. Obviously, you take it off to the side, it's less than 200. This is it's 216 degrees over here. So this is going to continue to concentrate over time, and the more it concentrates, the higher the boiling point will become, and we are aiming for 230 degrees Fahrenheit, which again, if I recall, is 110-ish degrees centigrade. When you go to be taking the final temperature, You want to be taking the temperature while you're stirring it, because you saw the temperature differential from one side to the next. So I find, just to be accurate for the pot of liquid as a whole, you take the temperature while you're stirring, and that'll probably give you a more accurate sense of what's going on in there. Once it hits 230 or 110, that point it's ready. You turn the heat off immediately, and you get your ladle out and your funnel out, and you start putting the stuff in jars. You make sure you let it cool to room temperature before you put a lid on. And at that point, you want to play around with wax or paper or whatever, you can go ahead and do that. But you basically put the lid on and store it away for the next 20 years.